Hello and welcome to the channel. I'm Sarah, and today we have a deep dive into light, especially near-infrared light, which is very healing and important for the body. My guest today is Scott Zimmerman, who's an optics expert with over 80 patents. He's also a research scientist, and he raises awareness to the importance of safe and healthy indoor lighting, and especially the role of near-infrared in human health. Scott has several publications, two of which are on melatonin, mitochondria, and the role near-infrared light plays in daytime melatonin production. Scott explains the various wavelengths of light, such as ultraviolet, the visible, near-infrared, and why they're important for health, and how to maximize your near-infrared light exposure. Scott also emphasizes the importance of natural sunlight and the detrimental effects of artificial light and also sunscreen on our health. We discuss the impact of artificial light on hormone dysregulation and hormone balance, especially in children, as well as the multifaceted role of melatonin, which is produced by the mitochondria during the day and during exercise, and what the implications of this may be. So I'll hand you over to Scott now. Welcome to the podcast, Scott. Do you want to introduce yourself and tell people about what you do and why you're an expert in light and optics?
I guess I get to call myself an expert because in the particular area I've been focused, there's not that much work that's been done. But my name is Scott Zimmerman. I'm an engineer by training and spent the last 30, 40 years developing new products. I have 85 issued patents in various areas, mainly around displays and optics and materials. And my background is like I say, I'm mainly an optical engineer. And I was surprised I got to working, I'd been working in lighting areas, and then they started doing the circadian work. And then I got to looking at, well, what's going on optically in the human body. And I was able to see that there was some really amazing things that the body does, depending on what wavelength range you're working on or looking at. And you find that the body goes to great extents to actually collect and harvest energy from sunlight in various bands of different wavelengths. And the majority of it is actually occurring in wavelengths that we can't see with our eye. And people need to understand that, sunlight is the part we see of sunlight represents only about 10% of the solar spectrum or less. And the body is using that other portions to do things. And besides just make vitamin D. And that's kind of in my focus is to understand the optics of the body. And then once you start understanding the optics of the body, then you basically say, oh, that's why this biologically is happening. And that's kind of where we're at this point.
Okay, great. Just so that people who are not familiar with light and physics, what, in simple terms, would you say is light, and what's a photon? Just to start off there, and then maybe explain what wavelength and frequency in terms of light means. But for a person who isn't familiar with biophysics, because as I was telling you, I did my PhD in fluorescence energy transfer, so it's something that I understand well. And if I try to explain, I'll probably confuse people. So I think in the podcast you did with Max, that there was a really good entry level introduction to light. And I thought it was absolutely fantastic. And maybe if you could do something sort of similar for the watchers and listeners.
I think, like I say, one of the problems is that the eye has a very limited range of sunlight that it actually looks at. If you look at sunlight, sunlight runs from about 240 or 250 nanometers out to beyond 4,000 nanometers. And that's the wavelength of light. What we see with our eye is a very small slice of that runs from about 400 to 700 nanometers. Okay, so you've got this large expanse of sunlight, and what we see with our eye is a little portion of it. And the problem is that people then assume because they can't see it that it doesn't do anything. And unfortunately, it does a lot of stuff. And the other problem is that people try and equate this large portions of the sunlight to heat. And that's one of my pet peeves is that heat is not everything. It doesn't matter what wavelength you're at. It's still generating a certain number of optical watts. And the the idea that heat what is the only thing that infrared does is a misnomer and causing a lot of problem. If I have one optical watt of near infrared and I have one optical watt of visible and one optical watt of UV, they're all same optical watts, you know. So heat is not what we do. We're trying to, you know, I don't know a good way to explain it better than that. To just say that people need to get moved past the fact that infrared is heat, because it's not. It's no different than visible or UV.
And also, I think because when you see pictures of light drawn out of different colors and different wavelengths, it's always like a wave. And I think, again, that's something that people get confused about as well.
Yeah, I think it's hard because at its most basic level, you really should be talking about the number of photons per second and things of that nature for at a given wavelength, and trying to do it with watts and lumens and all these other terms that we've developed over the years to try and describe what we see with our eyes. It creates a lot of confusion. But at the end of the day, you know, what you really care about is how many photons are going into what particular part of the body and what they're doing. And, you know, that's what I found was so fascinating when I got working in this area is that very little had been done to actually look at how light propagates in the human body, and especially within the near infrared component. There's some really great pictures out there by Bob Fosbury, where he shows the effects of how near infrared penetrates through the body and is dispersed within the body. And unfortunately, you know, that's there hasn't been enough work in the area to really understand how the body collects. But you really should think about the body as a solar collector, not as a, you know, penetration depth or thickness or how far it goes into the body. It literally is designed, especially within the near infrared, to actually absorb and collect near infrared and distribute it out to the rest of the body. And his pictures are just show, you know, it basically shows everything. Like I keep on saying, anybody who's had I had a told a Halloween story with a flashlight stuck up their nose or in their mouth can tell you that the longer wavelengths just distribute throughout the body and are very effective at collecting and distributing it to all the different parts of the body.
Okay, so maybe if we just start with ultraviolet, because obviously the ultraviolet C doesn't come through the atmosphere, but you can buy ultraviolet C for disinfection. But then ultraviolet B and A, those are going to have sort of higher frequencies or shorter wavelengths, so they carry more energy. Maybe if you want to just start with the ultraviolets and explain what wavelengths those are in and what they do in the body, and then we'll move into the blues and the greens and then the oranges and the ambers, and then back into the good bit of the infrared.
Yeah, no, you know, if you're dealing with UVB, you're talking 280 type nanometers, the shorter wavelengths. Like I say, there's the spectrum. The UVB is on the far left at the shorter, higher energy, shorter wavelength. And then you get UVA, which is a little longer, 350. Then you get UV, and then you get into the visible region, which runs from about 400 out to 700. And then you go from the out from 700 out to 4,000 with the near infrared and shortwave IR. So those are kind of the way it's kind of like a big rainbow, but it's we only see a small portion of it. The functions of the UV are, of course, to generate vitamin D, but they're more generally what's they're there for is to actually crack or oxidize cholesterol and in the outer portion of the skin. So it takes a lot of energy to essentially oxidize the cholesterol. It's not a very efficient process, but so the body has developed this ability in our outer skin cells to essentially form a little microreactor region. If you look at the work by Yakimo, if you see that how he showed how the outer part of the skin is literally photochemically bleached. So about 50 microns, just a couple thousandths of an inch. And that is used by the body to enhance our ability to oxidize cholesterol which then is used to do cortisol, vitamin D, sex hormones, a bunch of other things. And I don't think people appreciate the fact that it's not just vitamin D that's being generated in that UVB exposure. It's all the other hormones that go along with that that are all based on cholesterol. So, so then you go into UVA, that's what, and that's what you get you have a sunburn typically is associated with most of your UVA exposure. But UVA also has a function that actually helps with um, the efficiency of our ability to convert, generate, do things in the UVB region. So, unfortunately, the more you dig into it, the more you start to see that there's all these interconnected ways and systemic or symbiotic type approaches that are going on. We were able to show that even the far near infrared is actually having an effect on our ability to do vitamin D because it's actually helping the efficiency of which you're doing cholesterol changes or cracking cholesterol. So, um, I don't know what else I could put into that.
Okay, what about the blue and the green? So, because I think what's really important here is that when we live in houses and have glass and stuff, we block out a large portion of the spectrum. So it would be like, eating food with only 70%, with 70% of its nutrients lost. Also, blue light and green light can get demonized, although they're obviously there in the sunlight. So what do blue and green light do naturally when they come out of the sun?
Well, I think that people first need to understand that everybody likes to demonize the UV
Hmm.
and because it's got such high energy. But when I first got involved with doing the modeling, we modeled the where the light various wavelengths are being absorbed in the body. And what you see is that the blue, there's this work by Zostro, where he looked and measured the amount of free radical generation after exposure to different wavelengths. And what you find is that if you take a piece of skin and you set it out in the sun uh, and block the UV portion, you generate an equal amount of free radicals as you did when you were doing the UV portion. So the when you get into the violets, blues, and greens and cyans, they have enough energy to generate free radicals themselves. So, and the point being is that they're distributed a little bit differently, but there's there's a lot of evidence that the effect of the blues and the greens and the cyans are significant and driving a lot of other things that we're not quite quite understand at this point. So.
Yeah, because also I'm a big fan of UV light, and I can't stand the idea of it being demonized. So I think what you've sort of led into before we go into the red light is it's not only sitting inside that's a problem, it's also wearing sunscreen because that's going to block the UV light. And then, like you said, the blue and the cyans and violets can still get through. So maybe if you want to just elaborate on what your sort of views are on sunscreens and sunblocks.
Well, I've written a couple of papers on it, and I, well, what happened was is that when I started doing the models, what we do is we model where the photons are being absorbed in the body and the skin as a function of depth. So we do a three-dimensional model of where light is going, and then what happens is that you can take the data that we have from Zostro, which is electron spin resonance data, and you can get an approximation of where the free radicals are being generated three-dimensionally in the skin. What really is causing the problem is when you wear sunscreen, it basically takes away you normally, if you're outside and you're getting too much exposure to UV, you'll get a sunburn. You'll start to get the skin will get red, and it's a warning signal. You need to get out of the sun. Well, when you put sunblock on, sunblock only deals with the UV portion. It doesn't deal with the visible portion, the blues, the violets, the cyans. So what happens is that when you put a sunblock on, you're basically removing this alerting system that says get out of the sun, and people in general spend more time outside because they're not getting sunburned, and then they end up getting increasing their exposure to the violet, blues, and yellows, or cyans, which have enough energy and are localized right in the basal layer at the interface between the epidermis and dermis, as if you look at it optically. So basically what's happening is that, we've seen for decades, there's been an increase in basal cell carcinoma. And even though people are using sunscreen, well, the problem is that they're basically overexposing themselves to the blues and the violets, which are then localized in the area of the base where basal cell carcinomas go. So the idea or the argument is that you're basically setting yourself up because you're not getting out of the sun like you should, and you're continuing to get long exposures into the blues and the violets and the cyans. So
Okay, so if we move into the yellow and orange and red in the visible, what do you have to say about those wavelengths?
well, I think the problem is that you've got multiple different things going on. The body isn't doing just one thing at a time. And even though we like to run experiments where, okay, we're going to try and to understand what's going on with cyan or whatever regarding cancer, basal cell carcinoma. But the reality is the body's doing things with all the different wavelengths. And that's one of the things that was quite interesting is that you get out into the yellows and the reds, there's a much different response, but it's still doing something biologically that, and we're sitting here and we're playing games with our visible only lighting, what are they doing? Circadian guys are trying to pump up the blue and the violet during the day. They're trying to then suppress it at night so that you get just the yellows and oranges, but there's an entire portion of the spectrum that they're totally ignoring. So, I would argue to a great extent that a lot of the circadian is a self-inflicted wound, much like the same thing with using sunscreen. You're basically setting up a condition that's not natural and that doesn't have the benefit of the near infrared components, the longer wavelengths. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to, in this very limited range, it's like we're doing everything with one arm tied behind our back. And so all these different wavelengths are doing something different. And, I just posted a graph that kind of took all the different photobiomodulation papers out there and kind of showed, okay, here's what at this wavelength, your glucose is being reduced. At this wavelength, wounds are healing faster. At this wavelength, the cancer cells are getting having higher levels of ROS. At this wavelength, people recover from COVID faster. There's all these different things that are going on throughout the entire spectrum, yet what we've done is created an artificial environment that's only limited to about 400 to 700 or 650 nanometers. And so it's causing a great deal of angst within the body because it's not really each wavelength. Yes, each wavelength is doing different things are working together. But what's really the main issue is that it's really the ratio of different things. Like you say with UV. UV in the right amount is very important. UV without the near infrared, in my opinion, is dangerous because it tends to, the function of the longer wavelengths appears to be to protect and deal with the damage done by the shorter wavelengths. So
yeah, that's really interesting because you can buy things like spurty lamps which do have a high wattage. Then you can get small sort of black light UVA lights for the house. But again, like you just said, it's taken that wavelength away from the rest of the wavelengths in the sun. And in some ways, we're playing with biology we don't really understand properly. So shall we move into now the near infrared or just infrared in general, and maybe explain to people what it actually is? And it's not just something that's heat. There's a whole lot more to it. And it's And also, people think that it penetrates directly into the body, but it actually propagates itself through the body, and it ends up in all sorts of important things such as cerebral spinal fluid, mitochondria. And I know that you're an expert in this area, so I've been looking forward to talking to you more about this.
Well, like I say, I'm an expert because nobody else seemed to have messed around in the area too much. But I will say this. I mean, one of the things people need to understand is that the eye is easily tricked. And so what happens is you walk outside and you look up at the blue sky and you say, that's blue. Well, in reality, if you actually measured what's really coming into the body from the surroundings and everything about it, the majority of photons or energy that's coming into the body is not in the blue. It represents only a small portion of what we're exposed to when we're outdoors. And that's what I guess I'd like people to really understand is that the blue sky has got a ton of near infrared, longer wavelengths that's being either backscattered or reflecting off the surroundings. I don't know if you've ever done near infrared photography, looked at near infrared photography pictures,
Is that when
but
things are either black or white, and humans all look black and we all have white hair? That kind of photography.
well, that's shortwave. It's
Yeah.
the longer things, but in the near infrared, we all are kind of a little translucent, and but what happens is if you take in the picture in the near infrared, which runs basically from about 650 out to 1200, 1400 nanometers, it's so here's visible, it's over here. And what if you take a look at the pictures that are done, they're great ones on the internet. All the trees are white like snow. All the grass is white. Even the ground reflects more near infrared than it does visible. So what literally is happening is that when we walk outdoors, we're walking around in this almost integrating sphere of reflections coming off of the sun, where the visible portion is being absorbed by the trees and all that to define what you see as green or the red apple or all these different colors that we see with our eye. But in the near infrared, it's just all reflecting. And so we're getting all this energy that is being debumped into the body and absorbed and collected by the body. And then, like I say, if you look at some of Fosbury's work and some of ours, you start to see that the body then is set up in the near infrared to basically absorb and collect, distribute that, bounce it around, literally down into the crevices of your brain via your cerebral spinal fluid. So you've got all these different optical mechanisms where the body is trying to increase the ratio of the near infrared to the visible. Because why? The near infrared stimulates everything from waste removal to blood flow to the immune system. There's all these things that the body is using the near infrared to stimulate because it can't, the higher energy photons and higher energy photons in the visible and the UV have to be dealt with. I mean, they're creating all these damage, and the near infrared component is there to basically deal with the problems associated with the higher energy wavelengths. So, you know, and the more you look, I don't know if you want me to go into the details of it, but if you look in the papers, what you start to see is you start to see that there is a various different ways that the body is absorbing and distributing the near infrared optically. Has nothing to do with the biology. It's just the optics of it. In your eye, the majority of the photons that actually hit the retina don't come through the pupil. They actually come through your eyelids and through your sclera. If you look at a mother, the fetus, if you look at the optically, what happens is the mother's skin basically blocks the shorter wavelengths early in the pregnancy, but passes the near infrared deep into the womb, where the amniotic fluid actually has a peak transmission in the near infrared. Why does it do that? It lets essentially the baby is being bathed with near infrared, as it's developing, as the mother progresses through pregnancy, the skin starts to stretch. The wavelength range that is exposed to the baby is exposed to increases, getting and helping with the eye development processes. If you look at the brain, your forehead, you look at what happens there. Basically, the light print, the near infrared passes through the bone and into the cerebral spinal fluid. The cerebral spinal fluid acts like a light guide and guides the near infrared down into the crevices of the brain. Gray matter being on the outer portion and benefiting from that near infrared exposure. Now, what we went and created an artificial environment where none of that occurs. There is no near infrared in an indoor environment anymore. The LEDs have zero near infrared. The displays have zero near infrared. The windows that we have on the outside, the low E glass, reflect near infrared and prevent it from coming in. So we've taken out this major component, and now we're kind of surprised that there's these other issues that we're running into. And it's not like we took out a little. We took it all out. It's zero in most environments, and especially for people who are stuck in nursing homes and places like that. They are now living in an environment that is totally unnatural and essentially has been the largest reduction in solar exposure in human history. So, and I believe that very strongly that is why we're seeing a number of these maladies, including sleep disruption. It's not just associated with what we do with circadian. There's a lot more going on than just that.
So just before we move into sort of things like melatonin, what would you say that the infrared actually does in the body? If you sort of had to make a list of, this is why you need more infrared because it does X, Y, and Z, and what does it actually do?
Well, I think the main, that's kind of been the great debate as to what is the actual mechanism. Most people would say, the PBM people would all say that we've enhanced the ATP production, and that it helps with the efficiency of the ETC, the electron transport chain, is one set of arguments. I would argue that the main function is to stimulate antioxidant response, and that's what, because I believe that I think it's pretty clear that things like melatonin have extremely high antioxidant capability. And what we're showing based on the data that we have from the biosensors is that melatonin is generated in huge quantities throughout the body and being used and stimulated by near infrared. But like I say, you can go down through a laundry list of different things that people are claiming that the near infrared does, ranging from reducing glucose levels to all these different functions. But I think that's really where the research needs to go, is to try and figure out what is the real underlying mechanisms that we know it. They know all these benefits. I mean, people are not doing what they're doing with the red light therapies and all this other stuff just because it's for fun. They're actually seeing effect, even down to the point of dementia and ADHD and all this other stuff, that people are seeing benefits associated with going and getting some kind of an acute treatment. All I'm arguing is that what we've done is created an artificial environment that is not natural, and because of it, we're basically having all these maladies that we're having to go in and take a pill for, or get some red light therapy for.
Yeah, that's really important, because I was going to ask you about the photobiomodulation devices. But first of all, people can get as much near infrared as they want, because you can go outside with clothes on any time of the year, even sort of now in the UK when it's foggy, and there's always a supply of it outside. So does this tie back into what you were just saying, that yes, I've got multiple different lights in the house, I won't go into it, but in terms of what there is outside versus what's in my infrared lamp, what would you say are the differences? And again, nothing can be a sun, But would you say for people that really can't get outside, that it's okay to use the infrared setting on the red light device and get some of the same benefits, or do they have to take the red light outside and do it out there to get the full benefits? Because that's what you're meant to do with, say, a spurty lamp, is to use it outside.
Yeah, I think my my personal opinion is that you want to get as close to a match to the spectrum. We are designed to be able to handle 9 orders of magnitude variation in intensity, but across that entire, from sunlight down to the darkest night, you got 9 orders of magnitude difference in the exposure intensity. And the point being is that you you really, to handle that, you're really more interested in the ratios, because over that 9 orders of magnitude, there we are never exposed to higher energy UV and visible without an excess of near infrared over the entire range. Whether it's moonlight, whether it's daylight, wherever you're at, you're always exposed outdoors to a broadband near infrared emitter with that is in excess, as far has more energy in it than you do with the UV or visible. And so to me, that's really the problem we've created in the artificial world, is that we've messed with that ratio. If, like I say, if you're just sitting there under LED lighting, working on the computer like we're doing right now, and everything and you got a window there that's got a low E glass on it, there is zero near infrared being provided. It's all being blocked. That doesn't occur in nature. And I would also argue that the benefit of having a broadband near infrared source versus a narrow band, I think you can target certain things within the PBM. People do that. They basically say, I'm going to do 650 nanometers. I'm going to be 1070 nanometers, all these different wavelengths that are going to target. But what they're doing is they're basically maybe solving one problem and creating another problem. Because if you accentuate one particular biological process, the body's having to deal with a lot of stuff. It's not dealing with just, I've got too high a glucose, or I've got too high of something like this. I've got this plus this plus this plus this. And so it appears to me, based on the optics, that the body expects and needs and is taking advantage of the entire solar spectrum. When you start chopping off or you start accentuating one part of the solar spectrum over another, then you're causing a shift in the hormone levels and changing things within the body that was never intended to do. So I would say, as you say, the easiest thing is to walk outdoors and get a little sun, even if you got clothes on it. And Fosbury has some really good pictures where he shows the transmission characteristics through multiple layers of skin of clothing. So even just getting out and getting a little bit is, at least it's in the right ratio.
Mm.
That's what I guess I'd say at the end of the day. And I think we've gotten way too hung up on trying to have a certain number of milliwatts per centimeter squared of one particular wavelength. What you really need is you need the full spectral response or exposure that we get every day and have for billions of years.
I want to thank my sponsor, Lightwater Scientific, who helped me deliver free valuable information to you and also allow me to have great guests on this channel. Lightwater Scientific produce the purest and most deuterium-depleted water in the world. Depleting or lowering your deuterium has numerous health benefits, from better metabolic health, more energy, greater resilience, less brain fog, increased physical performance, enhanced healing, and healthier mitochondria. Deuterium is an isotope of hydrogen, also known as heavy water, because it's bigger and heavier than regular hydrogen. Even though deuterium makes up only 0.02% of hydrogen, it's found everywhere. Deuterium is a burden to your body because it interferes with the intricate chemical reactions that occur by slowing them down. Deuterium is kryptonite to your mitochondria, and we need healthy mitochondria to produce energy. There's over 60 years of scientific research on the negative effects of too much deuterium on health, and also the positive benefits of lowering deuterium in the body. Lightwater deuterium-depleted water is 100% safe and non-toxic. In fact, it's the closest in structure to the metabolic water that your mitochondria produce. Light water deuterium depleted water comes in 5 or 10 parts per million glass or plastic bottles. So level up your health by leveling down your deuterium today. The purchase link is in the show notes and use code DRSARA for a discount off your order. Yeah, that makes sense because I do have a really small panel that can produce infrared. So, and people always want bigger, faster, better. So, like you've said, because there's zero near infrared in my room at the moment, a very small lamp, I'm sort of, it's safe-ish. Then I've got an ordinary sort of 11-watt UVA bulb there, but they're nothing powerful. But would you say, like you've said, bringing in really large devices, I could potentially create myself a new problem because now I've got so much red light and infrared light in my room. I've shifted the spectrum and the ratios into something else that's foreign to the body. And maybe, I think red light panels are great, but like you've just said, you have to take in mind the ratios and the power of some of these newer devices.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right. I mean, my concern is that people are looking for a quick fix, and I mean this with respect because I do believe in the photobiomodulation, but it is amazing when they need to do something within 20 to 30 minutes in order to be successful. That's just the business model they're in. They can't really, you're walking around for 3 or 4 hours or 5 hours. That's why I believe, my personal opinion is that you fix the environment, artificial environment we in to have the right ratios, which is easy to do. I mean, we that's what we do with our light bulbs. We basically mimic the conditions that you would see if you were outside underneath a tree, by combining LEDs with some short filament bulbs and in one source. And if you measure that clear out to 4,000 nanometers, it mimics what goes on outside very readily and very closely. And it's easy to do. It still can be very efficient, but I think that people need to understand that it's really the ratio of the different wavelengths that seem to be what's really important because like I say, whether you're talking about moonlight or whether you're talking about direct sunlight, there's always an excess of near infrared that the body is expecting to see, and we've changed that. We've taken that away, and it's especially problematic at night now because what we're doing is we're pumping up blue and cyan and yellows and reds all over the place rather than just turning the dumb lights off. That's the problem, and it's affecting not only us, but insects and plants and things of that nature in ways that we don't really understand yet.
Yeah, because I think there are less fireflies around now at night because it's too bright. And also that's why I was asking you about orange and yellow and red light, because that would represent a candle or a fire that people used to have before everything was sort of over illuminated. But just to backtrack to the moon, because you've mentioned it a few times, and I don't actually know the answer to this. What actually comes out of the moon light-wise? I know you mentioned near infrared, but maybe a little bit more about moonlight, because people have asked me this before and I've said I'm not completely sure.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're basically looking at the reflection of sunlight off the surface of the moon, and all dirt. If you look at dirt or soil or anything like that, like I say, Bob's got some really good reflectance data on soil. But what you see is that it absorbs more in the visible than it does in the near infrared. So you actually get an enhanced amount of near infrared coming off of moonlight. Your eye doesn't really see it because, again, it gets easily confused because you switch from photopic to scotopic response of the eye. And so what appears to be a blue moon is actually orange if you actually measured it. But the eye kind of does a little game with you to make it look like it's bluish. But just in general, like I say, everything that our surroundings are absorbing visible, but reflecting near infrared, even the ground, as far as the effect on the ratio. And it really is this ratio that I think is what's so important. Because if you look at, like I say, you look at the eye, The eye is actually an amazing optical imaging element. You can see, all these great things. But it also is this in the near infrared, it acts as what we call a non-imaging element. It basically is a solar collector. And so what it does is it guarantees the proportionality so that you're always got an excess of near infrared on the retina whenever you're getting exposed to a certain level of light. Unfortunately, especially the little filament bulbs that you see at the Home Depot now that are LED, it has zero. It has zero near infrared coming out of it, but it still looks like the old incandescent. The incandescent had 10 times the amount of near infrared to visible coming off that filament. That's why it was inefficient. But that near infrared was actually beneficial. And that's what's really coming out of, I think, the science at this point is that we underestimated the importance of the near infrared component and the UV component, in the health of our body. And if you don't have the ratios right, then you've got an issue with how the body responds, because you take blue light and you expose the body as a person to blue light, it will cause the cortisol levels to rise, to elevate. Now, if you take and expose them to near infrared, it tends to suppress the cortisol levels, increase melatonins and things of that nature, that other hormones. So you've got these combating hormones that are sitting here doing stuff to make us function properly. And when we start playing games with the light spectrum, we're basically throwing that out of whack. And that, I think, is what the real fundamental problem we're fighting right now is that we threw away the part that actually protected us from the part we want to use. So,
Yeah, exactly. So with the light bulbs that you sell, will they work in the UK? Because or who can buy them? Is it worldwide, or is it Canada and US only, or is it, where do we get them? I'll put the link in the video anyway.
yeah, well, the we have a version that you basically can plug into any source, any power feed you got. You guys, I don't know, like I say, you can get our light and you can use it in the UK. In fact, there's some over there right now with Bob Fosbury, so you can see it. But to me, the point is that what I hope people take away from all this is that they need to get outside. You need to get your kids outside. You don't want to go and turn into a Chris, you're not trying to get everybody to get exposed. All you have to do is go out and sit under a shade tree or walk with a hat on or something, because it's these ratios that are so important, especially for children. I mean, one of the things when you look at it optically, children are much more in tune to the effect of sunlight or these spectrum changes, because light penetrates, a higher percentage of their cells are actually being involved in the process. And they're in the middle of trying to go through all these hormone changes anyway. And here we are, we're introducing them into an environment that tends to drive cortisol levels higher. I would argue that artificial lighting is basically overstimulating the majority of our children and causing these hormone imbalances we really don't understand enough about. And to me, it's a sad, because I believe that so many of the behavioral and neurological issues that so many children are struggling with can at least in part be related to what we've done with the artificial lighting.
But also it's the blue light and the dopamine depletion, because you've mentioned cortisol and melatonin, and then we'll go into talking about melatonin in a moment. Are there any other hormones that you know about, or that you want to talk about in reference to any particular wavelength of light that you haven't mentioned?
Well, I mean, that's really the problem is that there are such a limited number of real studies where we understand. Most of the hormones are working in antagonistic pairs. Cortisol to melatonin, dopamine, all of these, they're all interacting, testosterone, estrogen, they're all interacting to each other to maintain a balance. Now, you can go through the literature and the PBM literature and the LLT, low level laser therapies, and you can see that all these are affecting those hormone levels in one way or another. And you start playing those games, that's when you start creating these imbalances. And I think we've totally underestimated the importance of that. But really, the reason that I published what I published was is we only had data for cortisol and melatonin. They're all getting affected. Testosterone's getting affected. People are seeing effects. They don't maybe understand the effects, and some of them may not be good effects, but they're seeing biological effects by different wavelengths on all these different hormone levels. And it doesn't take much of a shift in hormone levels. There's a really interesting study where they measured cortisol and melatonin levels in people who are clinically depressed and schizophrenic. And what they found was is that compared to the someone who's not having those problems, the controls, that there was this 4x increase in the amount of cortisol versus melatonin at midnight, in these people. So what's happening is that you don't have to change these levels around that much to create serious issues for people. And where we don't understand, we don't have the data. Like I say, the only data that I could find was basically 4 papers that basically let us look at cortisol and melatonin. Testosterone and estrogen, all these things are being played as well, but we just don't have the data. And that's what I guess I'm hopeful that with the new biosensors that are coming online for the medical community, that we'll be able to get some data in real time, or at least with a high enough sampling frequency. And I think that's what people need to understand is that so much of the data out there is like for circadian, they go and measure it 4 hours later. The data we are showing is basically measuring it in real time and showing that there's all these changes in hormone levels that's going on that nobody was even aware were there. And that's where I think, the real science needs to go, is to continue to develop the, Gao's group down in has done some amazing work on biosensors. But when you can start actually measuring the effects in certain parts in real time, that's when you start seeing that, hey, a lot more is going on here than what we thought was going on.
Yeah, also, I think the other topic we'll go into is a lot of people associate melatonin as being a bedtime or a darkness hormone, but we were talking before about how when they've measured, I think is it serum, that there's lots and lots of melatonin in the morning. And also when we move about and just do things, exercise, whatever, the mitochondria produce melatonin. So it's actually there all the time, or a lot more in the morning than we would be expecting. So maybe if you want to walk people through that.
Well, like I say, there's only a very few limited number of papers where they actually measured melatonin and cortisol during an event. Most of the time when we go into the doctor and we do whatever they do a study on circadian, they put you down, tell you to lay down, be quiet, in the dark, don't eat, don't do anything. And the reason they're doing that is because if the minute you do something, all of a sudden the hormone levels start to move, and they move quite rapidly and quite in ways that we're not supposed to be moving. And that was one of the point of the paper with Theron and Gao. What it showed is that they ran experiments during exercise, and what's happening to the hormone levels during exercise. And lo and behold, what you find out is at 9 a.m. in the morning, if you get out there and you start doing a bunch of exercise, you spike your melatonin level. It goes way up. It goes up to maybe 4 times what it is during the night. Same thing happens with cortisol. They go up together when you're doing exercise. Same thing happens with light. Same thing happens with cold water immersion. Same thing happens with, if you get during sex. I mean, honestly, hormones are not static. They are not, they're changing quite rapidly. And when you start looking at that, you start to say, well, where's it coming from? It's 9 a.m. in the morning. How is it the melatonin level in blood is going to 200 picograms per milliliter at 9 a.m. in the morning? Is it coming from the pineal gland? No, it's not coming from the pineal gland. So you really have a choice of where's it coming, a question of where it's coming from. And it appears that it's coming from the mitochondria in your muscles, and that the body is using or generating a massive amounts of melatonin. So why do they generate? You don't need to go to sleep when you're doing exercise. It's generating it because melatonin is the body's premier antioxidant, and it has the ability to, and it's non-toxic in most cases, and it just appears that the body uses or is generating massive amounts of melatonin if you measure it at a time scale that is appropriate. You know, if you, the minute you stop exercising, it takes about 30 minutes and it goes back down to baseline. But is during these, that's why I say there's only about 4 papers that I know of where they actually measured things during life, a life event. And, that's where I think it was missed is that melatonin is not just about sleep. Melatonin is basically protecting the body and dealing with all the free radicals and reactive oxygen species being generated when we do anything. So
I think that ties in really well with what you've been saying about the ratios of light, that if hormones work, which they do in ratios, if you start fiddling with the light ratio, that can propagate itself into hormone ratios being off. For example, just using one wavelength of light, like the blue, up goes the cortisol, but the melatonin goes down. Whereas, say, if you're outside exercising, the melatonin and the cortisol were more likely to go up together. Is that correct? Because I just wanted
absolutely.
to go into also, you reminded me of something about melatonin being broken down by blue light. So again, is that correct about that this is again sort of just like speculation that the light ratios are going to directly influence the hormone ratios, and the more we start fiddling about with single wavelength or just giving somebody a single hormone, where for example, using a single wavelength of light could be like giving someone a single bioidentical hormone.
Oh yeah, and it I think that blue light in particular, the blue light gets the nailed, but it's blue, cyan, green, violet. They're all generating, an effect. And but the problem is that they're narrow band. So what happens with blue light? Ray showed early on that you expose somebody to blue light, cortisol level goes up and is elevated just with blue light. So, what are we doing? Most people that are doing circadian now really are basically trying to pump up the alertness or essentially increase cortisol levels in the body using a high level of blue content in their circadian light systems. And I don't disagree. It makes you have higher cortisol levels. That's the fight or flight, the stress hormone. It also pumps up your adrenaline. So, okay, now you got everybody pumped up, artificially, you've increased their amount of cortisol levels above what they would normally have. But you also did that without any benefit of the near infrared to counter what's going on with the cortisol levels. So now you get people who are chronically exposed to cortisol. And there was a really interesting paper by Mello where he took and looked at the hormones generated from taking a hit of cocaine. And what you see is you see a very similar effect on cortisol. You take cocaine, you take a shot hit on it, and it takes about the cortisol level elevates because it's a stimulant, and it sits up there, and it takes 2 hours for the cortisol to pull back down to 50% of what it was, to pull back down by 50%. So we start playing games with light, and like I say, Ray did exactly the same experiment with blue light and showed cortisol goes up. So we are obviously changing certain hormone levels around and controlling them. It's a well-known fact, and we know it does it. In fact, we are intentionally doing it to some people. Well, there's a consequence to every action, and the problem is we don't know enough about the mechanisms to know if it's safe or not safe to do. And I would argue that a good portion, what a good portion of what's going on now within the circadian world is they're elevating people's stress levels, but they're not providing the counter to it by putting in enough of the near infrared component. And I don't think that anybody can tell you that it's one wavelength that's going to solve the problem. I think it's going to be, this is what nature does. We should do that. That's a good starting point.
Oh yeah, definitely. And also sometimes people buy a device and say, "Oh yeah, it makes me feel great," but then back to the cocaine thing, that makes people feel great as well. So it doesn't mean,
Yeah.
you
Well,
know,
it
you can
is a
always trust
problem.
your body. Yeah.
It's a real problem because you know, I believe that there's real benefit for some of the PBM stuff, and I believe that there is, but it's like taking an aspirin for a migraine. Well, the aspirin did other things too, you know, and until we understand all those, there can be some, especially if people get carried away with it, that you can maybe get yourself into some trouble. But I think our biggest problem right now is we've created this artificial environment that has no relationship to what's going on in nature. And I remember I was sitting on a public a panel at the Department of Energy, but several years ago, and I was sitting there and I was trying to explain to them, in my not great way, but I was trying to explain that there's, that these things, what they were trying to do is they were trying to get rid of the incandescent bulb, and I said that they were sitting there and they had the guy that was from our NRDC was making the argument, and he held up an incandescent flood lamp and an LED flood lamp, and he said these are identical. And I raised my hand and I said, there is nothing even close to identical between that incandescent and that LED bulb from a photobiological standpoint, because that bulb that he had in the one hand was giving you 10 times the amount of near infrared to visible ratio, and the other hand with the LED was giving you zero. And now I believe we're kind of getting the science together to show that, yeah, that was a mistake. It was wrong. Uh, can we do better than an incandescent? Yeah, we can do better than incandescent. We can save some energy. But when you start playing games with these ratios, then you're starting to mess with some of the basic functions within the body. And, you know, like I say, I started out doing the optics, and the more you do the optics, the more you see the body is going to a huge amount of effort to localize and get the near infrared into areas that are the most sensitive to us: the fetus, the retina, the brain, all these different things, blood vessels. You start looking at it optically and you go, why is it going to this much trouble? Is it just happenstance?
Mm.
No, it's actually trying to give us the best opportunities for survival. And unfortunately, I mean, I think that what we've created at this point is an area where, at least for a small portion, or for some portion of the population, we're really creating a hazard, a harmful environment in which they're trying to, live. And it's sad because it's so easy to fix. And, like you say, bring back the kids building a fort up in the treehouse, or make it so that people go out for recess. We can't even go and play a sport now unless it's underneath artificial lighting inside a building, climate controlled. That's this doesn't happen that often anymore. And the result, I think, is pretty much the solar deficiency issue that we're fighting.
I think there was a paper out a few weeks ago saying a deficiency of sunlight, natural sunlight in the day, is worse than blue light exposure at night. But I think it's like you said, there's limited studies. But which would you can say both are as bad as each other? What do you think's worse, the artificial light in the evening without blue blockers or candles, or being inside all day without sunlight?
Oh, that's a hard one.
Mm.
I, it's like we've managed to figure out the worst way to do. We've decreased the component during the day, and we've increased the bad part component during the night. And it's so hard. I've got a neighbor down the way, and she's got this. I swear she could light up I could see it reflected off the moon if I had to. A thing as bright as can be, and she runs it all night. and it's blue white, and it's annoying. And I don't know. I'm a big dark sky advocate, but my main thing is we should turn it off. You know, we
I noticed that when I was staying in Georgia, because I've just come back. I should have invested in a few catapults, because we people turn them off in the UK. But like you said, my friend's neighbor could have lit a sports stadium, and it was just on all night. It's like, what's it for? Why is it there? And I really, if I'd have been able to find a catapult shop, I would have there would have been an incident. But I did notice, and now I'm back in the UK again. Yes, we have that problem with street lights, but people tend to turn their own lights off. They're the odd person that has one on, but it's not nearly to the intensity you're describing. But how much do you think, because I think it's something after having this conversation, if you explain to somebody, oh, would you please turn that off because it's really hurting you and your sleep, not just everybody else's, how open and amenable are people to, because like you said, I think they just don't know.
Yeah, I think that's really the problem. I don't think anybody wants to cause, any damage to the environment. But, you'd mentioned the fireflies. I remember that just since she's put it in, our firefly population went down. It's just anecdotal, but there's more and more indications. There's a really great study where they took spiders and scorpions, and they put them in these cages in their little thing. They had a little burrow and all that. Then they watched them for 16 days, and one of the cages was exposed to natural sunlight, and the other one was exposed to artificial light. And they one of their observations is that the spiders and scorpions were in the one that was in sunlight were out all the time foraging, doing whatever. The ones that were under the artificial light stayed in the burrow, and they never saw them come out of the burrow.
Oh, wow.
And then they took the spiders and scorpions, and they actually dissected them and measured cortisol levels, and they found that the ones that were under artificial light had higher cortisol levels than the ones that were in natural sunlight. And so, I think that we're screwing around with a lot of things besides our health. You start playing games with I grew up in Kansas, and we had one barn light, and yeah, there were a few moths that went up around it, but in general, it was pretty dark out there, and everything seemed to get along just fine. And I really think that we need to think this through a little bit better.
Yeah, definitely. And I think sometimes it's just ignorance, for example, our neighbors and their lights, that it's actually hurting them as well. And just educating people on light being this really powerful medium and not just this thing that we can see or not see in. And I think just to finish off, I just wanted to ask you, it's slightly digressing, but about saunas. I want to thank my sponsor, Chroma, who help me deliver free content for you and allow me to have great guests on the show. Your light environment shapes your health, but modern lighting, it's ruining your sleep, affecting your mood, and disrupting your metabolism. Chroma engineer precision lighting solutions the way nature intended, precise, powerful, and built to last. For example, the Sky Portal, which is designed to align your circadian rhythm, boost mental clarity, and improve your mood. With an output of over 10,000 lux, it mimics natural outdoor lighting and helps prevent seasonal alteration disorder, or SAD. The Chroma D light, which delivers UVB at a precise wavelength so that your body makes natural full spectrum sulfated vitamin D, which is needed for immune health, bone health, hormonal balance. Supplements can't replace what light does best. The Vitalux goes beyond red light therapy, combining red light, near-infrared, violet, and cyan light to stimulate opsins, which are key light-active proteins that influence metabolism, brain function, and mitochondrial efficiency. Then there's the Iron Forge, a very affordable portable red light device delivering over 80% near-infrared light for deep tissue repair, recovery, and better mitochondrial function. For a brighter tomorrow, upgrade your light, upgrade your life. Use code DRSARA for a discount on all Chroma products. The link's in the description. because again, there's all kinds of people saying, oh, this is a far infrared or a near infrared or a whatever sauna. And I've never really got into it because I don't have any issues with saunas. I think they're brilliant. The one that I use is just a shed that's got coal in it. So what sort of what does it actually mean? And like you were saying, that people mix up heat with infrared. In the sauna space, what are they actually referring to? And if there was infrared, near infrared in it, is it a bulb, or is somebody just pretending that it's got near infrared in the sauna?
Well, I mean, it's so easy to put near infrared back because, you take a little filament source and it's 100% efficient
Right.
basically at generating near infrared and shortwave infrared. Um, I think there's a lot of, when we came up with things like UV, visible, infrared, near infrared, shortwave, they weren't chosen based on the biological effects. They were chosen kind of arbitrarily,
Mm.
and so it can create some confusion for people. But I mean, I'd love to have a sauna. I think they're great,
Yeah.
but I would pick one that had some near infrared component because I believe very strongly that you want to have as much of the spectrum as you can get into it, and it's easy to do. And I would just say, a little incandescent bulb up in there, run at low wattage, is going to do a lot. Is closer to what you're going to get outside.
That's what
But
that comes back to. If somebody's put LEDs of say 1,000 nanometer or 800 in the sauna, it's back to what we were just talking about. We've put only one wavelength in again, whereas you're saying that if it's you truly want to put the near infrared back into the sauna, it's just a simple diffuse filament bulb that's going to produce a spectrum in the infrared range. Is that correct? And this idea of putting all these LEDs in, it's creating another problem.
well, creating problem or just quickly, I'd like to go through this one thing because I think it's so amazing optically. Like I said, with Yakimov, he did this amazing set of experiments where he measured melanin and the amount of lipids or cholesterol in the outer part of the skin. Well, what he also showed was is that the melanin that's in the outer part of the skin is oxidized. Well, when you think about it, it's really hard to oxidize melanin. So what's happening? What appears to be happening, based on the work of Hudson, is that when we're exposed to sunlight, the body generates a significant amount of hydrogen peroxide. So what it appears to be going on, and in the short wave in particular, the longer wavelengths, they're localized, all the photons in that area are localized in the outer 50 microns of the skin. So what appears to be going on is literally the body is photochemically oxidizing melanin so that more of the 285 can go in and actually oxidize cholesterol. So it's like we're all walking around with this very thin micro layer of a microreactor that's actually trying to optimize the amount of cholesterol that's being cracked and turned into 7-hydroxycholesterol, which is used for cortisol, used for vitamin D, used for testosterone. All these things are going on. And to me, optically, it's just absolutely fascinating that the body would go to such an extent. But you start looking and you see how difficult it is.
Isn't it about
That,
8% efficient anyway, that conversion to vitamin D?
right. But if you're outside in the sun, optically at least, you're photo-oxidize the melanin or photochemically oxidize the melanin, it causes a 5x reduction in the absorption characteristics of 285 nanometers in that outer 50 microns of the skin. And it's true for not just people with light skin, but it's true for people with dark skin. So the body is doing things we have no clue. We have a very limited understanding. But the fact that Hudson showed that if you take and expose yourself to UVA, visible, near infrared, and shortwave infrared, there's a 6x increase in the amount of hydrogen peroxide relative to doing any of those individually. So, it's, to me, it's just absolutely fascinating how complex and what extent the body goes optically to do what we're doing. And, you think about that from a standpoint of someone who doesn't get out in the sun. Yes, they still can generate vitamin D, but they're doing it at a lower efficiency level than someone who's out in the sun on a regular basis. And basically all the cholesterol derived hormones are affected by this.
That's really interesting. So just to backtrack, people with more melanin in their skin, so it's darker, the more melanin you have, the more protection you've got against UVs. But then you're also, it's harder to make vitamin D, correct? But also, did you just say that then you're going to absorb less near infrared the more melanin you've got in your skin? So therefore, you need to go outside more if you have more melanin for the near infrared.
Yeah, we did a paper with I did a paper with John Luis down there in Miami, and he's been going around to church pulpits and all that, trying to get the Black community to understand how important getting regular sunshine and vitamin D levels and sleep and all this other stuff is affecting their thing. And we were able to measure, probably one of the few people that measure the difference between someone who has a very high melanin level and someone low melanin level out in the near infrared. And what you find is that they need about 3 times to 4 times the amount of near infrared exposure to generate the same stimulation of the hormone levels that a person with light skin has. Now, conversely, you take a person with light skin and put them down at the equator, you're toast. But there's been this huge movement or migration of the Black population into places like Chicago and things like that. And, I believe very strongly that it's something that we need to look at on seeing whether or not there's the impact of solar deficiency is larger in the Black population than it is in the white population. It just makes sense that they need a higher level of exposure. That's what their body was designed for. And now we've taken and done this flip with eliminating the near infrared component. And the other thing is that when you start looking at it optically, you mentioned it early on, when you get into the longer wavelengths, it's all water absorption. We all look the same. We all have black skin. We have white hair. We have clothes that are white. So everything shifts. Everything you think about light, kind of changes depending on what wavelength range you're in. And, UV, while it has the highest energy, when you actually do the numbers, the shortwave infrared actually has the highest density of photons in a given area because of how it is absorbed and localized in water in particular. So there's all kinds of games going on with the body that we are just now starting to understand a little bit. and,
Oh yeah, exactly. Because the thing about water and light in the body, that's a whole massive topic. But also
oh,
melanin is another one of my favorite topics because I think there are so many things that melanin does, from sort of splitting water into electrons and hydrogen, but also isn't it in granules in the body, not diffuse? And there's also melanin around or near the DNA to protect it, along
oh
with
yeah.
neuromelanin and eumelanin. And then you were talking about the oxidized melanin on the skin. What else can you say about melanin and what it does?
Well, optically, it's just as you say, it's fascinating because if you look at the optical models that most people publish on, they're based on the idea that you have this level of absorption. It's a continuous material. That's not what the body does. The body makes little granules and they put them in the best places they can put them. They're very efficient. But optically, a dark granule in a clear matrix is entirely different than a matrix that is tinted, which is what everybody's doing when they're coming up with these penetration depths and things like that. That's not what happens in the body. The body has taken, and they're very efficient at putting melanin around the nucleus so that it protects the DNA. but it also has a very low level of melanin in between those cells. So you can't just optically model it as being, all the absorption coefficient of the epidermis is, X number of per centimeter. It's that it doesn't even make sense when you're looking at it from the optic standpoint, which I think is absolutely fascinating because it's a what actually creates this propagation. Literally, the interstitial fluids around each one of the cells is essentially acting like light guides, sending it deeper and deeper into the body, guaranteeing that all the cells, the majority of cells, are getting some level of exposure in the near infrared. And basically, like I say, the problem is that all the papers that are out there that are modeling penetration depth are essentially wrong. So, and you can just see it with the picture from Bob, which I think is absolutely fascinating.
So I'll have
So,
to invite Bob onto the podcast. So when it comes to explaining to people what nonlinear optics is, how would you explain it to people who've heard the word but don't know what it actually is and how it relates to them?
well, well, I would make it a little one step simpler. I mean, everything that we do and we model for optics is based on ray tracing and geometric optics. When I say it doesn't take into effect the wave property. People can think about, they like to think about light as some particle or something like that, but it also has wave properties. And what's really fascinating is that when you look at the where melanin is put and the interface between the epidermis and dermis, you have this highly modulated surface in here that everybody says, well, it's for good adhesion. Well, optically, what it does is it localizes by wave optics. And I did a little study on it, but what happens is you can get extremely high localization of photons or at least the energy distribution in these modulated structures. We do it for solar cells all the time. We put all kinds of surface textures on the solar cells to improve its efficiency. Yet the body is doing exactly the same thing inside the skin. And it just happens that melanin tends to be put in those areas. Is it working for enhancing the effect of melanin on converting water to hydrogen and oxygen? I don't know. But to me, optically, it's just absolutely fascinating that we're so primitive in our modeling relative to what's, it's very difficult to model the real wave effects in some of these structures. So,
Oh no, yeah, I know. I think I just asked it because sometimes when I think optics are so fascinating, it's the part of the barrier is that it's hard to explain to people, and they miss the point. So therefore, you have to explain in many different ways, and then come back to how it all benefits them. So maybe to wrap up, what sort of advice can you give to people, and also where can they find you and your bulbs? Because also you mentioned you just written a little article somewhere about different wavelengths on different hormones. Well, where can people follow you? And what advice would you like to give to people?
well, I limit my advice to what I think is a natural approach, and from the standpoint of I just think that getting your child out in sunlight, and it doesn't have to be direct sunlight. It doesn't have to be a clear day. It doesn't have to be, just get them out, let them do some exercise and get exposed to natural sunlight and the reflection. In particular, even in like right now in the winter, there's still a huge amount of reflected light coming off of all these different surfaces, including the ground itself. So, I mean, that's what I do. As far as our light sources, you can find them at niralighting.com. And you can we sell a lamp that basically has a AC to DC converter on it so that you can use it anywhere in the world. And it comes with a bulb that's a DC bulb, so it has zero flicker. It has all these other benefits. And so I guess I would say that, if people could just get themselves outside a little bit more, and enjoy the fresh air. I don't know if you ever saw any Roger Seaholt's videos.
Oh yes, light is medicine.
Yeah, well, he's got a new one, and
About
I give the
COVID
guy,
and
I
yeah.
give the guy a lot of credit. He's putting his mouth where his action where his mouth is. He just did a video where he showed that he had a COVID patient,
Mm.
and he took the COVID patient out for 20 to 30 minutes each day, and showed the it was an observational study, but he actually was showing, and the patient was saying, I thought it was a bunch of bunk, but I really felt much better once I got outside for 20 minutes. And so he literally took somebody who was on oxygen, put them outside in the sun with the staff around it, and showed how it enhanced the person's healing. Yeah. So I think that in general, we underestimate the body's been surviving for millions of years, long before we had vaccines and all this other stuff. And we should take advantage of whatever of those defenses and help those defenses, because I believe what we're doing is we're basically undermining the body's ability to protect itself, and creating problems that are don't need to be there in the first place.
Okay. Oh, that's brilliant. And also, I think what I took away from this conversation is about don't underestimate the moonlight and walks in the moonlight to get near infrared as well.
Yeah, well, it's interesting how people have perception. As you talk about perceptions, I mean, if you look at, there's 9 orders of magnitude from sunlight to dark night, but there's another 100 trillion photons per second that we're sitting on top of when we're in what we consider dark. So I mean, don't underestimate that night is doing things as well. So
Oh no, no, that's great. And also, can people? I found you on LinkedIn, so is that somewhere where people can find your articles or your posts? And also, I can post your paper as well. Where do you put your resources for people who are interested?
I typically put it on LinkedIn. I've been doing a little bit on X, but mainly LinkedIn. I find that I get a lot of good contacts with people, and they tend to actually are familiar with the field a little bit.
Mhm.
And it's hard, as you say, it's really hard to uh, explain in a way that is useful, I guess, to people, some of the stuff going on optically. But just I think that in general, people need to quit underestimating the body's ability, and they need to help it do its best, you know.
Yes, definitely. Anyway, thank you very much for coming on, and I've really enjoyed this.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. I hope that people will get outside a little.
Yeah, no, I always tell people to do that, and then they get annoyed at me. But I'm only trying to help. So yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Be sure to check out my free PDFs in the description. I have several on different topics that relate to quantum biology and light.